My name is David Cooperson, and I'm honored to be here. I'm more than excited to address this wonderful, knowledgeable group. I think it's fantastic. And I'm from Los Angeles, and I originally was in Philadelphia. I was going to do this over
the Zoom.
But what happened is a friend of mine in Philadelphia got, they think is terminal brain cancer, and they moved up the wedding of some of her relatives till Sunday, and that's why we got to Philadelphia. So after that, that and the 7-hour trip on the Amtrak, and I'm here.
That's great, thank you.
Right, so I'm...
Can you introduce yourself?
David Cooperson.
Yeah, but I mean that you're. May I just say that you're you're a 32-year veteran of child protection advocacy, and that you've written this amazing book called The Holocaust Lessons Against Corporal Punishments.
And I was also a therapist for this 32 years.
Great. Thank you.
And my work, after the 32 years, my work had just begun when I retired to advocate and write about lack of children's rights and legalized child abuse. What happened is that I have to talk a teeny bit about my childhood. My first memory, I believe, was my brother being, two men from the state coming to place my brother, because my brother was spanked and beaten by my parents, and what happened is every time they spanked him, he laughed. And he started almost to attack them, and they moved him out. And I've been afraid of making any mistakes for a lot of my life in the beginning, that I would get moved too. And I was hit sometimes, even though I didn't do anything. So my parents, in many ways, were very positive, so it was very confusing. Now, after my brother was placed, he went to a place in New Jersey, which is a fairly famous residential treatment center. And a couple years ago, I asked him what happened when he got there. He said, I was crying, and the director, who was fairly famous, punched me in the face to stop me from crying. So hitting, and my father was an orphan for the Hebrew Society in Philadelphia, and he got beaten. He tried to run away from his orphanage. In fact, the therapist that worked with our family, Dr. Seymour Siegel, was an orphan, and he wrote a book called An Orphan in New York about the experiences, and there was a lot of beating going on. And they called people in orphanages then inmates. And I checked it out several times because I didn't want to say it if I wasn't sure. Pretty much child abuse is rampant. I've had a lot of it, and that's, I think, what motivated me. And when I worked, I studied neurology, and I studied the laws, and I wanted to know what was going on, and I found it very frustrating at work because very little was done with the laws and with neurology or whatever, and we were basically putting Band-Aids on cancer. So after I retired, I contacted about 80 agencies because I wanted to do this right. And I spoke to most of the main players in the child abuse field and corporal punishment field. And I got on many advocacy groups, and I went to an international conference on it. One of the people I met was the former president of the American Psychiatric Society, Dr. Paul Fink. And Dr. Fink took me under his wing, and he told me, he told me that, this was about 14 years ago, he told me the ACE study was just coming into being, and that's what's going to finally get kids, help to end this corporal punishment thing. And I'll talk about that more, because the ACE program, Adverse Childhood Experience, has progressed more than you can imagine. I'll talk about that more a little bit later. Okay. And I also, as Steve Hosson said, I met him. He's another one of the people I came across, and there's a lot of child abuse in the cults, and it's one of their staples. And I studied some of the Nazis' child rearing habits. There's a lot of child abuse in that. In fact, they're the only country in the world that brought back corporal punishment in schools, according to a doctor, Robert Fathman. And
when was that?
huh?
When?
Huh?
When Hitler took
When
power,
Hitler was,
he made it a state.
he was a Holocaust, they brought back corporal punishment in schools. Since then, Germany learned from the war, but we didn't. Our laws are horrendous, and I'll talk about that. Let me see. Now, and I want to talk about, I found it interesting because almost every cult, they hit children and they believe it is a staple. But there's one person I wrote something for Stephen on, is Stefan Molyneux, and he had an interesting twist in it. He believed in hitting children. However, he told the people that were hit children to go away from their parents, never see them again, and he sort of got them in a cult. And I wrote an article for Stephen on that, and I got a lot of responses
Free
from him.
Domain Radio is the name of it.
Yeah,
Internet.
yeah. Now, I came across, I'm going to try to get some, ground this a little bit. I came across a legal scholar. His name is Justin Driver from the University of Chicago, and he initiated a course called The Constitution Goes to School, and he has a book in 2018 called The Schoolhouse Gate: Public Education, Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind. And this is what he said: that Americans in public schools continue to be paddles is an atrocity. Future generations will regard our unwillingness to eradicate this act of barbarism in 2018 as an act of shame and embarrassment. No legal issue sits higher atop the long list of needed educational reforms than eliminating corporal punishment against students. The sole remaining government actors are permitted to strike with impunity. Now, he mentioned something in 1853, and I had to check because I had to check to see if he was right. In Indiana, 165 years ago, an Indiana Supreme Court justice, he said, "The public seems to cling to the despotism of schools which have been discarded everywhere else. The husband can no longer moderately chastise his wife, nor the master his servant or apprentice. Even the degrading cruelties of the naval service have been arrested. Why this person, a schoolboy, should be less sacred in the eyes of the law and that of the apprentice sailor is not easily explained by law." And there is, from Brooklyn College, there's a law professor named Cynthia Godso, and she studied a lot of the child abuse hearings, and she said the judges rarely looked at the tsunami of research. They rarely looked at that, and they gave little anecdotal stories about what happened to them, and they, you know, when I was young, nothing ever happened to me, which is the hardest nut to crack, I think. All right, now, also, this is the one that cut everyone off at the knees. In 1977, the United States Supreme Court rejected an attempt to make corporal punishment illegal in all 50 states. And the case was Ingraham versus Wright. James Ingraham in school, I believe it was Florida, was walking out too slow. And the principal grabbed him and took him to the office. He said, I don't want to be hit, I don't want to be hit. 3 people held him down. The principal hit him at least 20 times. At least 20 times. He was bruised, he was battered, he was bleeding, he went to the hospital. There may have been permanent injuries, and his family wasn't taking it lying down. They went to all the way to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said that corporal punishment in schools, even that was not cruel and unusual punishment. And that led us an avalanche of court cases in favor of hitting kids. Now, over the past several years, there's been attempts to get Congress to end corporal punishment in schools. I and groups, we contacted Arnie Duncan's office, who was the Secretary of Education. When he was in Chicago, he vowed that he would stop corporal punishment from happening. When he became the educational secretary, he said it's states' rights. So he just totally backed off of it. And so what happened is, let me go over this. In 2000, we got them to say that it's a civil rights violation. So Congressman Carolyn McCarthy in 2010, 2011 set up Bill 5628, and I made many calls and wrote about this. Carolyn McCarthy husband was killed on a train by somebody named Colin Ferguson.
Oh, sure.
And what happened was that she was so pissed off that she became a congresswoman, and she tried to get gun control, and of course they ran her over the coals for that. But she picked up on this, and she fought like mad, but it never got past committee, and only Democrats were sponsors, not Republicans at all. And I even I made too many calls to, there were a couple of doctors who were representatives, and every medical association in the universe opposes corporal punishment in schools. And I talked to them, I pleaded with them, but they didn't change, because they're in the Bible Belt where they believe spare the rod and spoil the child. However, that I don't believe that was the Bible. It's said by a poet named Butler. And anyway, if they followed the Bible directly, they'd be killing people with stones. They just cherry picked that. So it's a very interesting thing. 2011, 2012, House Bill 3227 was again proposed by Representative McCarthy, but it was also rejected, and we made millions of calls and the whole deal. And then she got cancer, and she did one more in 2013, 2014. Bill 5005 was the same, it got rejected. And it didn't even get past the committee because the head of the committee, I have to, it was, the Republicans had Congress, and they wouldn't let anything like this go. So it was absolutely horrible. And Alcee Hastings, I believe he's from Florida, picked up this fight in 2015, 2016 with Bill 2268. And the person who was the head of the Education and Labor Committee was named John Klein. And I don't know how many times I called him, I wrote him, or agencies called him, he didn't budge an inch. He was the guy that held the football for Ronald Reagan, you know, the nuclear code. So this man is Marine. However, he was a Methodist, and Methodist in the past, John Wesley believed in hitting babies, but since then, Methodist religion is one of the most positive religions on child abuse and neglect, and they have very strong laws that say you cannot hit kids. If you see somebody hitting kids or anything, go to your congressperson. But he was the congressperson, and I reminded him of that. And I have to admit, I talked to the Methodist Church too a little bit, because I really wanted to get that. And they said they would talk to him. I don't. But anyway, it was just awful. You couldn't even get it out of committee, and move on. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the lessons from the Holocaust. And as a matter of fact, in a response to the Supreme Court's ruling, one of the American Federations of Teachers said that people in the rest of the world are going to think we're Nazis. So speaking of Nazis, who revolutionized corporal punishment for children, and I told you all about bringing it back to school. But what happened is that there was a man who was a rescued Holocaust survivor named Samuel Olener, and he was the only one that survived from his village of Baboa. And what happened was, with Samuel, is that he wanted to know why only 0.5% of the population saved the Jews. And he didn't take it lightly. He got a PhD in sociology at Berkeley. And he worked with a lot of people. And he found one of the common denominators for people that rescued Jews as opposed to those that didn't was they received almost no physical punishment as children. And the parents were problem solving, whatever. So what happened is that he also, in Humboldt State University, set up a institute for altruism. He's written many books, and he's pretty much retired, but he's a real hero. Now, Eva Fogelman was a displaced survivor, and she said the same thing. And there was a book called The Authoritarian Personality by Frankel, Brunswick, and Adorno, which talked about the harm it does with children. I want to bring up a couple Holocaust stories. Janis Korzak was I believe a pediatrician, and he was unbelievable advocate for children. And what happened was, he'd written many books, he'd been in the government, he did everything, and the Nazis said, "We won't consider you a Nazi, we'll let you go because you're so esteemed." But he didn't take that, and he ran an orphanage, and he worked to stop the hitting in the orphanage, and he called children citizens. When my father was an orphan, they were inmates, and he was totally opposed to it. He wrote many books on it, and to me, Jews don't have saints, but he's a supermensch. So what happened is that they were taking the children to the gas chambers, and he had a chance to get out of it. But he said no, and he marched in file with the kids for their dignity, and he died that way. So that's a real hero. Another one is Bruno Bettelheim, who kind of faked his education. He had an art degree, PhD, and he ran these these autistic homes and stuff like that. And what happened is he was very much against hitting children, whatever. But little did everybody know that he was doing. They found out later he was doing it. He was like University of Chicago. He was like an icon. He talked about the refrigerator mother, autism. He was like a big deal. Everybody was afraid of him. But it all came crashing down, and the kids were reporting that he was beating them, and he even went in the showers and looked at some of the girls. And this is a person who was vehement about treating children good. And I think it's a case, I might be wrong, of identification with the aggressor, which took over. But it's really a sad story because I think he started out, but his issues caught up with him. Now, denial, which I said is too weak a word to describe what's going on. I'm going to discuss a couple of situations. Texas Child Abuse Court Judge Adams, Adrian Peterson, and emergency room physician Dr. Giacomo Arumbala, who is also a Fresno assemblyman, also all physically injured their children and denied the injuries are real and said they were just spanking them. Now, the Texas judge in a child abuse court, he denied he even did it, but somebody videotaped it. He was beating the crap out of his daughter. She was in a wheelchair, and she was screaming. Then he said, "Oh, I just was spanking her." And Adrian Peterson, what people might not know is, I don't know, maybe you do know, but before he hit his kid and got in trouble the first time, one of the mothers of his children, the father killed one of the children, beat him to death. A couple months later, he was hitting the child. And then what happened is that he just couldn't stop, and he told the NBC News and the Bleacher Report that he was still hitting his kids after he was suspended and everything else. And I don't know, they sort of covered that thing up, and he was mad. He wasn't concerned about the kid, he was mad that they violated his confidence when he talked to the reporters. So he learned absolutely nothing. And this guy who's an emergency physician and assemblyman also hit his child. So it doesn't seem to matter if you have that problem, what you do. Just to keep it straight with football players, Dick Shafrat was a Hall of Famer for the Cleveland Browns about 50 years ago. I remember him, I don't know. And what happened is he was big, so he used to beat kids in school. And when he got out of football, he became a representative in Ohio, and he fought against corporal punishment, even though he's a Republican. Finally, with him and Nadine Block of Ohio, they stopped it after about a 30, 40-year battle in that state. And they had a Democratic governor, which is probably the thing that took it over. So, what I saw a lot was a thing that Dr. Richard Kagan, and I think these examples show, is called the rule of no marks. What that is people become experts at hitting children and not leaving marks. I worked with a deaf kid who his mother put a towel around the pipe and beating him, and we couldn't figure it out until we went to the hospital with internal injuries. And this is, I saw this all the time, working there all the time. And let me see, Richard Kagan, who is a esteemed psychologist from Albany, he worked with these kind of kids all the time, and he came up with the rule of no marks, and he said it's partly for the rule of thumb is the rule of no marks. So what happened is that I believe that the laws and our attitudes force people underground, and it's like cat and mouse if you work in child abuse and neglect. And that's one of the reasons I believe no child should ever be hit, and I have a stronger reason for it. Sacramento, California Assembly person Sally Lieber, she was going to try to get a law to stop hitting children under 3. And she told a few people, and this gets surreal. The message somehow got to every news station, to O'Reilly, and they were all condemning him. The Democrats were yelling out, "How could you do this?" You know, and these are 3-year-old kids, and they get hit the most. And this I wouldn't have believed this if I didn't see it, but it's surreal. And Governor, and it was on Saturday Night Live, even did a skit when it called "I'll Whip Your Ass." What happened also is that Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor, and he got beat up pretty good in Austria. And he was going to be for it, but the Terminator terminated his support when he found that everybody was going in a different direction. She courageously put the bill through and got crushed. People will call her home and curse her. They call her the cat lady. They call her everything in their book. Her office, they had so many phone calls. And that was even before she sent the bill through. So it hit a nerve. And an interesting thing was, some of these men's assemblymen acted like children when they heard it. They went, na 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 na. So, and they went like this, and the whole thing. And it hits at a really deep level of people who've been hit or somehow protecting their parents or whatever it is. And that was, I don't think too many people know about that. Now, not to leave the East Coast out, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, I think Steve told me, on spanking, what happened is that they didn't stop it, they just told people how to do it. Which is the worst thing in the world, because that was the first thing I learned in child abuse and neglect. I made a mistake of talking to my, don't hit him like this, just hit your hand 3 times and da-da-da. And my bosses, they were there for 30 years. No, you don't do that, because that gives them permission. And so I learned my lesson, and I'd say 60%, 50% of the books on people write about children and child abuse, they talk about spanking. I know Dobson, and who's an interesting guy, because he became afraid that the child might get hurt. And he said you can't hit children if the parents are angry, if the parents have domestic violence, if they're alcoholics. He even said whimsical and whatever, but he believes in spanking and hitting hard with an implement. A guy named John Roseman said hit with the hand. Every one of them says something different. Some of them said you can hit babies, some of them say 1-year-old, 2-year-old. And so now babies and toddlers are the victims of physical abuse, and they bear the brunt of the punishment. Dr. Margaret McHugh challenged the denial. She worked for Belmont Hospital in New York. I believe she's a pediatrician. And she wrote, I always told my medical students they beat babies, and they didn't believe me. And I had to say it again and again and again. So people just didn't have that sink in. There was a report in the 80s called the Shame of a Nation report, which almost floored me. They studied why kids died, and they had a list of like 500 kids over a period of time that died, and I swear 70% of them were under 3. And so these kids, most defenseless, you tell people to spank kids, they're going to do it to babies. And I know my parents hit me and they were afraid of the law. If there was a law saying don't do it, they probably wouldn't have done it because they were terrified of the law. And there are some people, even if it saves a few kids, it's worth it. So that was shame and denial on a new level. Now, there's been massive research which doesn't get much traction in this country. Dr. Elizabeth Gershoff of the University of Texas at Austin studied 40 years of research on spanking, and she did meta-analysis and whatever, and she found 99% said it was dangerous, none said it could help. Murray Strauss is another, he's the father maybe of the Stop Spanking movement. He wrote the book Beating the Devil Out of Them because one of the reasons for hitting kids is original sin. He did research on the gray matter, cognitive skills, aggression, whatever. And then there's Dr. George Holden, who's from Southern Methodist University. He held an international summit about child corporal punishment in Dallas. People from all over the world were there. And the interesting thing about him, he is really invested, and before he even speaks, he starts to cry. And I was very impressed by that because he's able to show his feelings. Another researcher is Dr. Tracy Afifi, who, we're going to talk about this later, she did research to show that spanking was an adverse childhood experience. They just had 10 that weren't spanking, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Joan Durant, also of the University of Manitoba, researched 20 years of spanking. Dr. Catherine Taylor of Tulane researched aggression from spanking in very young children and found that they became more violent and they're more likely to have domestic abuse. And there's all these domestic abuse policies, but they usually weasel out of saying the kids are in danger. I know because when I worked there, a husband could be beating the crap out of his wife and they say, oh, the kids are all right, you know. So there's a very big disconnect. And I actually talked to one of the pro-physical punishment people. His name is Dr. Margaret Guinot. And she, everyone who's seen says this research is pretty weak, but she said that in 3 to 5 year old kids, the physical punishment actually helps them. And no one else found that. But before she even had this stuff published, she was talking about it, and Fox News picked it up, and it was all over the place. Her little bit of research got 1,000 times more representation. All these people busting their tails. Now, Albert Bandura, imitation and modeling with his Bobo experiments was another one. He was before that, but he showed that if you show kids hitting a doll, a blow-up doll, they'll hit their own little dolls. So now my question is, why didn't we have to have research about the danger of physical punishment to all adults, including prisoners and military? We just accepted it's dangerous. With children, research results must be perfect to even begin to think it is dangerous. So I think they don't accept 100%, and the whole idea, they don't research anybody else to see it. So I believe in childism. There's like a racism on children, like I said in the beginning. Now, the one who did the rule of no marks, Dr. Kagan, had worked with worked to write with the Harvard Child Development Center. He wasn't there, but he wrote. They wrote something on child welfare and physical punishment, and a couple of the Harvard people, Dr. Martin Teicher. I apologize.
He's a friend.
Teicher, I apologize. What happened was he said he studied the neurology, and he found out that it affects the brain, even the fear of being spanked. And he says it's dangerous to the brain for a child to even be spanked. And Dr. Jack Shankoff of the Harvard Developmental Center did other research on that, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, yeah, he did a lot of things, and he wrote The Body Keeps Score, which it does. When somebody's hit, it affects every cell in their body. Now, I want to compare the United States denial on children's rights to the rest of the world. 50 nations have made it illegal to hit children at home. I think 100, maybe 150 or so have made it illegal in school. The United States won't have any of that. There was a United Nations Convention on Children's Rights, I think it was a long time, but 1989, and almost every country, not almost, every country to 200 accepted it, and some of them that were even really bad with the spanking actually moved on that. The United States is the only country that didn't accept it. George H.W. Bush said it was states' rights. Barack Obama said it's a tragedy, it's a shame on our country, but he couldn't do anything with it. And there's a group of Republicans who have made a pact, they're poised that if they try and get the Convention on Children's Rights again, they're going to fight it. So it's really a tough thing. Now, I also contacted, I read a book called God, Identity, and Ashes. And what happens is they interviewed Holocaust, children of Holocaust survivors. And what happened is Shulamit Reinhardt, she's a chaired professor at Brandeis, she said that what her parents went through made her feel that they were going to hit her in school, spank her or whatever, and she was terrified. This is how it affected her. And she never saw any hitting or whatever, just stuff she saw. So I sent her a book, wrote to her, and she asked me to write an article for an Ezine 614, because there's 613 mitzvahs, but there's always one more. And the article is spanking kosher. Spanking is not kosher in Israel, but it is kosher in the United States. I wrote an article, it's in the packet on that, where I wrote that the United States should learn from Israel, and I explain why and what the differences are. The Knesset actually studied science and took it seriously, whereas in this country I'm not so sure science is held in this regard in great esteem. Okay. Now, the Surgeon Generals some of them tried to stop corporal punishment in schools. Two Philadelphia Surgeon Generals, Dr. Everett C. Everett Koop, he said there's no reason ever for spanking, and it never did any good. He made a big statement, went nowhere. But I go back to Benjamin Rush, who was totally opposed to spanking. He was one of the founders. And when you hear founders, you hear rights for guns, this, that, but they don't say probably the most educated founder was opposed to hitting children. He was way ahead of his time. He's a pioneer. He set up Pennsylvania Hospital, and he was a strong conservative Christian, but he rejected hitting. So he was a powerful person. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Averse childhood experiences study, which surprised me. I was pleasantly surprised because it took effect in all. They have branches of it in all 50 states, and when Dr. Fink told me about 14 years ago, I said, he was a prophet. Unfortunately, he died recently. He asked me if he could write an introduction to my book, but he died, and I really miss him. He was amazing. Now, there were 20,000. There were there were 17. What happened was that doctors Felitti and Anda. Felitti was in Kaiser Permanente. Anda was from the Center for Disease Control, and they both came up with this study. They worked with obese people, and they found that as soon as they were doing better, they dropped out, and they found out they had a lot of adverse experiences. So they did a 20-year study on 17,000 people, and they found they had 10 ACEs, and they found the more of those you have, the more it affects your mental health, your physical health, and lifespan, like the telomeres in your cells and whatever. The 10 adverse experiences are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. There's 10 household ACEs: addiction, domestic violence, mental health, losing an important person, and they wrote this, and the research is everywhere, and every state, even the most right-wing states that hit kids in school, they're preaching about the ACEs, but they're not connecting the dots. So one of the things I want to do is try and work with the ACE people to connect the dots and talk to their Congress people, because I think the ACE is a ray of hope. I really think so. And the recently Tracy Afifi, who I talked about, study found that spanking was an ACE. And that really thrilled me. It was just in 2017. So I have a lot more to write about and talk to and call people about. I don't know if I'm going to see any major changes in my lifetime, to tell you the truth. Even though we have almost 100% research over 40 years, we have every major medical educational society saying hitting kids in school was wrong. I don't think we'll get over it anytime soon, and in families it's like the law. Now there was a recent. Now I did a presentation for homeless group, and I studied that, and they're also considering to make homelessness the 11th ACE. So they're looking into things. They're looking into things that could. Looking into poverty, racism, whatever. I hope they look into childism, but even though nobody accepts it yet. And there's more positive developments just in the ACE. The American Academy of Pediatricians came out with a report. They had a statement before they're against hitting children, but they came out with a real long report. It got a lot of news attention. I don't hear about it so much anymore. And my wife is a family physician, and in one of her family physician journals, they had a big, recently, 2017 or 2018, they had an article on the ACEs and they talked about how doctors should talk to their patients about ACEs, and it should be part of medical school curriculum. And Vincent Folletti didn't think that they would necessarily do that because it'd be expensive to make that many changes, but I think they can't afford not to do it.
Dr. Cooperson, we'd love to hear more, but we also want to be sure we have time for some discussion.
Okay, I will. I was just getting down to, and I was going to talk about the brain with the
Yes,
amygdala and
please
things
do.
like that, but I think people are aware of that
Can
pretty
you
much.
just say something quickly?
Yes.
And then, because we have 10 minutes left.
Huh?
We only have 10 minutes.
You mean,
We end at 12.
oh, you went to 12. Do you want me to
Yes.
end before? I can do that.
No, we'd like some discussion with you.
Quickie on the neurobiology, real quickly on.
Yeah.
Actually, I
a
could
minute-
end right now.
No, quick, please.
Oh, all right.
A minute on neurobiology.
All right, neurobiology. Well, what happens is, of course, this is a brainstem with breathing and heartbeat and whatever, and then you have the amygdala, hippocampus, and what happens is when kids are beaten a lot, the messages don't go to the reasoning part of the brain, and they become very reactive. I know when I work with some kids who are beaten pretty good, if you just touch them, they turn around. So the amygdala is like the canary in the tunnel, and it sends down cortisol, which can kill cells, and telomeres can shorten, and there's a lot of physical symptoms like heartbeat, breathing faster, sweaty palms, and tunnel vision, and chronic awareness of there may be danger, and that you can't think of anything else. So I think basically this part of it, with the amygdala, the cortisol, and not going to the frontal part of the brain, is, for my purposes, the crux of it. Yes?
Two fast thoughts. I learned from Jolly West about the Tarahumara Indians in Central America.
Mhm.
These are the guys that run 50 miles playing a football game of some kind.
Yeah.
And they have a zero history of suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that seems to matter is that no child is ever punished for anything. They're shamed. And that apparently leaves no residue of guilt, and therefore they don't commit suicide a great deal.
I can see that.
Second thing is, you're probably familiar with a book called The Discovery of Childhood.
Actually, I don't.
Okay, but the point the author made is that to understand that childhood was a state, was a relatively late development, and that in the Middle Ages, children were stuffed into the walls of houses as insulation.
Oh, yeah.
So to realize that there was a person there took actually a significant number of centuries to develop. And so in a way, this is a new deal. Finally, I'm interested in your sense of how you understand American resistance to this issue. It seems to me it has something to do with privacy, which affects
All
gun
right.
control and birth control and all these other things.
Well, it's, okay.
That's it.
All right. Well, one thing is states' rights, that's for sure, and it is for privacy. Americans, and it's our conservative Christianity religion says it comes out of the Bible, and you can't argue that.
Yeah, I can argue that.
I know, but I mean,
Jesus said, "What you do unto these
Yeah.
little ones, you do unto me."
yeah.
So they're quoting the wrong part of the Bible.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know that, and
And
I
Jewish
said
families also
I said it's,
do.
but I'm saying that the people who believe in that, they won't listen to any research. They won't argue with that. So we have the religious thing, and I think we have kind of a childism going, where it's not just hitting kids, but children's rights. I mean, getting them health care. I mean, that's just one of the things that hitting kids. But I trying to get that stopped because you can do a lot of damage quickly that way. And the other things I hope will change over time.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Yes.
I wanted to just mention that there's an interesting parallel of this problem that plays out in the care of persons with intellectual and developmental disability who live in group homes and
Yeah.
have behavior problems, maladaptive behavior, sometimes self-injury or aggression. And there's a tension between whether there should be strict responses for treating them or, positive behavior supports versus restraint and other strategies that are seen as inappropriate. So I think there they've won the battle of protecting the people, at least up here in Massachusetts and the northeastern states. I assume it's nationwide that the people are protected. So
But-
I was curious if you could comment on whether there are states that have outlawed it, because the states' rights issue is not the only reason it's not being solved, because at the state level, people could solve it if there wasn't the same resistance that there is at the national level.
Right.
But is Massachusetts allowing corporal punishment in our schools?
No.
So some states have outlawed it.
Oh, only 19 states it's legal. And Indiana is one of them. It's not in the South. Colorado, which had the pioneers of child abuse research, Kemp and Steele, they haven't outlawed it, and they've had all those shootings and everything, hasn't moved them.
So in 19, you're saying 19, it's still
No,
legal?
19 states,
So
it's
31, it's illegal?
It's legal in educational
education.
settings.
I think
but-
private schools can do pretty much what they want, so it's probably public schools. It's 19 states where it's still legal, and it happens mostly to black males, autistic children, and disabled. And
Because they're exasperating. I think one of the problems that you face with the resistance to solving this is when you say that there's no benefit of hitting. Because the benefit of hitting might be immediate, that it might stop the child immediately if you're not paying attention to long-term effects. And in order to get people to stop doing something, you can try to prohibit it, but you need to replace it. Obviously, everyone knows this. You need to replace it with other tools. And so
Absolutely.
that people may feel helpless that there's no way to teach all these people who impulsively want to hit what they could be doing instead that would require a whole shift in their philosophy of child rearing. Like, it's immediate if you slap a kid. Like, I was hit by my parents, but it didn't negatively affect me that I know of, because it was judicious and it wasn't cruel. And if I swore at my mother, I knew I was gonna get slapped by my father, and it didn't, I don't think it left any lasting scar.
That explains a lot more.
Yeah.
But it taught me not to be disrespectful to my mother, and it was a pretty swift.
well, I also think that one of the reasons. Go ahead. You want to finish? Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I also think one of the reasons in America we're very loyal to our parents, and if our parents hit us, and if we don't hit our kids or whatever, we're in some level feel like we're disrespectful because my parent did. I can't go against them, and there's a loyalty there and a guilt if you do something different than your parents. So there's very deep. There's some very deep things going on. Yes.
Just wanted to, the hitting is an obvious thing, we're all aware of it, but as you mentioned up there that, and as they mentioned in the neurobiological studies, that neglect or the lack of the positive human interaction, the lack of the brain development in those areas of the child, that has long-term consequences in babies, children, neglect, humiliation, all of those can have negative pathways set off and remain and continue. It doesn't have to always be physical abuse.
Oh yeah. And Bruce Perry, he was done an amazing amount of research on this, and the brains actually can be smaller physically. The cells can have less connections from hitting. The telomeres don't develop. I mean, there's actual things that happen, and people need to know this. You have to get through the wall. Yes.
No, I was just gonna say, it seems hard to, in trying to get through the courts and so on, is that the definition of child abuse is so broad. And I think people feel like maybe you just slap a child in the arm or something like this, which Mark was talking about. To have the term be so broad
Right.
as something as, okay, you can't hit a child, which the court can't address, because, hitting can be boom, or punching, or it can just be a gentle slap. And so I think parents look at that when you talk about it, they don't know what you mean. I mean, it's so ill-defined where the boundaries are.
Oh, I know.
That it's very hard to bring, to get any legislation passed, because everybody interprets hitting a child from their own perspective.
Right.
And, you know, they may just, you know, slap a child on the rear or something like that, and they think, well, I should be able to do that because it gets the child's attention, it doesn't hurt them, they don't cry. It just sort of says, hey, you know,
Mhm.
rather than a verbal command versus, you know, the fact that it does physical. I mean, in some ways, it seems to me to be easier to bring a case if you called it assault of a child.
Right.
Because assault is a legal definition, is something that leaves permanent, visible damage on a person, versus child abuse is just sort of loosey-goosey.
I agree with you 200%, and if I had more time, I might have. Something, I couldn't cover everything, but there's a lot of people that say that they shouldn't, and in England I think they call it smacking.
Yeah,
They
you
need
just
they
smack
need a
them.
different,
But
they
a
need.
smack
they need,
is not
yeah.
like beating a child.
Yeah, yeah. So they have to have a different definition. I agree. Yeah.
Can I just add, just the Holocaust lessons, you mentioned it, but I want to highlight it. The connection for me is the people rebelled against the Nazis because they hadn't been programmed to obey authority figures who threatened violence to them if they didn't comply to the orders of the Nazis. They were raised to develop a conscience, to think about their neighbor, to reason and such. That's my theory, at least, in my understanding.
Yes.
A few things. One,
Please.
cultures, whether it was Nazism or Japan or whatever cultures, hitting, humiliation, shame, preceded the Nazis, still exists
Right.
in many of these cultures. I'm a child of immigrants. I still remember what my grandparents say, and they were dead long before the Nazis
Mhm.
came in. And that stuff is still going on. And again, the hitting, what you're mentioning, hitting and that sort of thing, that neglect, and especially humiliation, when you mentioned Bruno Bettelheim, I watched him give lectures, and he would humiliate and shame and put down anybody who challenged or asked him about what he was doing. These were adult social work students at U Chicago. So in a sense, not only does it inhibit, does it reinforce that kind of behavior in the child, it carried into adulthood, and then they perpetrate it elsewhere. And Bettelheim was doing that, and it wasn't physical on these people, but the shame and humiliation he created as they left that classroom. They never asked another question again in his lectures. And when you mention, and again, you know, the Nazis didn't invent this stuff in Germany. I have German parents,
Right.
and they used as much physical corporal punishment as any, they weren't killing, but they also used shame and humiliation,
Mhm.
and that preceded. The Nazis didn't invent it.
Well,
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for having me. I'm very honored.